Welcome to Be Provided Conservation Radio, sharing stories and information about the environment, wildlife, and the people who are dedicating their lives to protect the world for future generations. These inspirational stories will take you from the Santa Cruz Mountains to remote areas of Africa. Here are your hosts.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our new season of Be Provided Conservation Radio. I'm excited to speak with our guest today. Our topic veers slightly from our typical interview with people working with animals and conservation, but I've been wanting to cover more aspects of environmentalism and protection of our planet in various ways, and was really excited to be introduced to our next guest publisher who enlightened me to how our guest shows us how we can give back after we die. So I would love to introduce our guest and get the conversation started. So our guest today is Elizabeth Fournier. She is affectionately called the Green Reaper and is the author of the Green Burial Guidebook, Everything You Need to Plan an Affordable, Environmentally Friendly Burial. She is owner and operator of Cornerstone Funeral Services outside of Portland, Oregon, and she serves on the advisory board for the Green Burial Council, which sets the standards for green burial in North America. And she lives on a farm with her husband, daughter, and many goats, which I love. And to find out more about her work, please visit www.thegreenreaper.org, and I will have all her information posted in our show notes, so please feel free to check those out as well. So welcome to the show, Elizabeth. I'm so happy to be talking to you today.
Thank you. I can hear Carmela and Roxy outside my window. They're bleating at me. I gave them some cereal this morning, but they're really hankering for their grain. So they'll have to wait a little bit because I'm talking to you.
Well, I'm sorry for the goats. Sorry you have to wait for your breakfast. So
they'll be fine. Yeah. They eat everything.
I know. I love goats. So how many goats do you have on your farm?
We're a rescue farm, meaning people come in and people come out. They're goats, but I call them people. We also have sheeps, too. And right now, we just have a handful. So we have some sisters, some sheeps, and then some mothers and daughters of goats. And so not a huge gaggle, but they're very healthy right now, which is good. Sometimes when you rescue animals, they don't come in on the best shape. Sure. And then sometimes, unfortunately, you fall in love with them and you name them and snap tons of pictures of them, and then they pass away. But I guess that's why I have a green burial cemetery for my pets on the farm, too. So we all go around in a circle of nature.
I love that. So, yeah, interesting. I never thought of green. I always think of burying your pets as green anyways, but that's interesting. So you have an interesting life, it sounds like, and I'm really curious to hear more about your backstory and what led you to be called affectionately the Green Reaper, and your love of animals, obviously, with the rescue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I was working in the corporate funeral world for a lot of years and just kind of going through the ropes and realizing this wasn't really the dream of why I thought as a child I wanted to be a funeral director. I was upselling caskets and we were having sales meetings about profits, and I thought, silly me, that this job would be about helping people and about really making this transition easier for them. So one day there was a call I received, and it was from a person who knew a person who knew a person who owned a dilapidated, falling down, failing, repurposed goat barn funeral home in the country, and would I be interested in taking a look? And I thought, this is my ticket out of the corporate world. So going out to the country changed my dynamic and how I could actually be a funeral services practitioner. It changed it full fold. No longer was I wearing a black suit and trying to have to give a sales speech, but I was being able to go into family homes and I was being able to allow people to do things how they wanted. And I found out in quick order, people in the country don't understand why they need to buy a plot in the cemetery if they already have their own acreage. So that was a wonderful eye-opener for me, that all of a sudden we were taking care of burials in people's yards, something, of course, we did many, many years ago before the advent of what we call the funeral industry now. So as time went on, I became known as that girl in the country who was doing these things. And then the name of the Green Reaper came. And I think the Green Reaper is a really nice, eco-friendly play on the Grim Reaper.
Yeah, I love it. And yeah, it definitely seems more friendly. And that's great. So have you always been a country girl? Have you lived in the city and then moved to the country to adapt? I'm just curious.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was actually born in San Jose, California.
Oh.
So I was a Bay Area gal, a San Francisco, and then my other big city was Portland, Oregon. So when I got this job offer in boring Oregon, I thought, oh my gosh, that's Mount Hood. What is that out
Yeah.
there? That's a place where they grow berries and pumpkins. So my drive along the meandering Clackamas River out to this barn on 40 acres with old farm machinery and deer statuary, I knew I was in for something really different, and little did I know.
Oh, nice. It sounds like you've adapted well. And how long have you been doing the goat rescue, just as a little aside?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been doing that for 6 years now.
Oh, great. Good job.
So I
So-
live in a log cabin in the woods, and I'm a bona fide country person, and I don't see myself going back.
Yeah, I don't hear you. Like you said, it's really quiet where you are, and that's great. So good for you. So it sounds like a happy life. So can you explain to us what exactly is a green burial, and compare that to what we know of as our conventional burial methods today that we're familiar with?
Absolutely. So if you think about, 150 years ago, when you hear stories or watch movies, a burial was really simple, wasn't it? Somebody would pass away at home. We would lovingly take care of our loved one. We would have the carpenter or the guy down the street or the lane or the grove build us a simple pine box. We'd lay our loved one in that. We'd put them in the wagon and maybe bury them in the backyard or maybe down the street in the churchyard. And it was all very simple. So that's what a natural burial is. It's that idea of not having a body, which has been embalmed, not being placed in some sort of a lacquered or metal or steel casket, and then not being put into a grave, which has a concrete or a polypropylene or a steel grave liner surrounding it, which a lot of cemeteries use just so the grass stays in a nice even formation. It's really getting back to basics. What's happened now with the funeral industry is we have a lot of resources that go into products that aren't really necessary. There's a lot of chemicals going into embalming fluid, again, not necessary. And the costs. Think about the costs. We hear these commercials on TV that say, get your funeral insurance because your average funeral is $10,000, and they're not kidding.
Yeah.
Once you have all those accoutrements, you need to actually buy your burial spot. So we have those memorial parks now that are sparkling green with all the pesticides and herbicides to make the grass so bright, and we have the nice, even, lovely places, and you're spending thousands of dollars for a grave space. So people have come along and have said, wait a minute, isn't there another way we can do this? Isn't there a way that we can think about the environment and future generations? Can't we save some of the green cash in our wallet? We're very much a do-it-yourself culture, and people have realized they can be buried in a cardboard box, in a simple sheet that's been on their bed, a simple pine box. And now that people are realizing that they can do these things, we're really making the environment and the world a little bit of a better place for what we're going to have left.
Yeah, I like that. And like I said, yeah, it helps to give back after you die. So I was surprised by reading how much embalming fluid there is yearly that we go through, which contains formaldehyde, right? It's a carcinogen. So I think you said in your book like 4.5 million gallons of embalming fluid a year. And that's just crazy, and that's just going, well, it's probably staying in those caskets that don't degrade either, but still.
With embalming fluid, that started in the 1860s. That's something we did for the boys in the Civil War to get them on trains and to get them coming back. And what's we found over time is that those toxins are going into the soil, And we're finding out that the top hazardous waste generators from the EPA, a lot of that is that horrible formaldehyde. And we currently produce enough of that formaldehyde in that embalming fluid to fill over 1 million Olympic swimming pools each and every year.
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, if you just sit and think about that, that's wow, that's an amazing amount of fluid, which ultimately will seep into our groundwater, which ain't doing good things.
No. And you also brought up a good point that I didn't really think about, is to take care of these plots. You're dealing with, nice pristine grass, the pesticides and all that to keep that resting place pretty. And that's not necessary either. So interesting. So, and so you mentioned, my next question was going to be, when did we start embalming and some of these? And you mentioned the Civil War. And I like in your book, too, that you do go through a little bit of history of burials and the methods. And I think that's really, really good for people to see that transition or read about that. So...
Yeah, I'm happy to share some more about that, because I think people
do.
are very fascinated to find out, because really 150 years ago, green burials were the only option. That's what we were doing. And it was just the Civil War that came about, and no longer were the women really washing and dressing and grooming the bodies while the men dug the graves. We were now preserving bodies. We had Abraham Lincoln, who had passed away, and he was an absolute beloved president. He traveled over 1,600 miles by presidential train through 180 cities and 7 different states. So you have to imagine that body had to be preserved. So President Lincoln, of course, was embalmed. And after that, the embalming, after the extended publicity of that really took center stage. So the death care industry was born. We had boys who started to go to school, and then boys went on to become the funeral parlor directors. So rather than have your body in the front parlor and have the family attend to it, we ended up having the boys whisk your body away to the funeral parlor. So that really moved forward. And then it just became the norm. It just became what we did. When you had a loved one die, you're in grief, or you're in shock, disbelief, saddened, and it's just easier to pick up the telephone and have the professional tell you what's going to happen and what they do. And again, full circle, we're coming back to people saying, wait a minute, I think I have some rights here, and I think I'm learning that I don't have to have my loved one full of these chemicals, and I don't have to buy some of these products. And it's a really neat place. So it's fun to talk about the history of it, because people always ask, well, how do we get here? And is green burial trendy? And no, it's not a trend. It's just us going back to simpler times to save money, save the economy, save the environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And and I find that really interesting. And I was going to ask you, too, a little bit about, we always think of cremation kind of being more environmentally friendly, but that's not necessarily the case, as I read in your book, too. It does save space, and it's probably less expensive than conventional, but there is also some other environmental factors to consider, it sounds like. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so sure. Yeah. Everything from that idea of we're going to be burying steel into the ground, and that releases toxins over time. We have concrete in the ground that slowly will be porous and slowly will break down. We have those issues. We also have that idea of people saying, well, forget it. I don't want to buy a grave space. Why don't I go ahead and be cremated? So that's another issue that we're coming up against, too. And we're finding out with cremation, even though it seems like you're going to have less of a space in land, ultimately your whole body goes up into the ozone layer. And I know that sounds kind of funny and doesn't really make sense, but it's hazardous because the poisons here are leaving the earth, going out into the air. The deceased have teeth filled with mercury. And really, once the body turns into ash, all of those tainted particles, the varnish chemicals and the mercury, all that floats in the air. It lands on the farmlands and the parklands and in the oceans. It gets into the wildlife and the pets and ourselves. So it's not great stuff. So what's happening is we are coming again to a point of realizing what can we do to make life better and afterlife better. And green cremation is something. And have you heard of that?
Yeah, well, just through reading through your book. So I was hoping you could share a little bit if you're willing to. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So green cremation has some interesting names. Now, the technical name for that would be alkaline hydrolysis. What you would hear people talk about in funeral homes, or if you're reading articles, it's called water resumation or biocremation, green cremation, water cremation. There isn't really a name everybody's settled on yet because it's a relatively new process. It's something the Mayo Clinic did years ago, but this is something now that it's coming to light that there's about 12 states who have decided this is a legal form of disposition, and merely rather than using the heat of the flame for what would be more of your standard cremation, we're having the body in a bit of a stainless steel chamber where there's some water. It's pressurized water, and it is some potassium. And we're going to go ahead and have the tissue just slowly break down. We're going to be left with a skeleton. And then from there, we're going to have the same output, cremated remains. You're going to get an urn back, which has ashes in it.
Interesting.
So the potassium hydroxide, it's a natural chemical. It's what people would use to make soap and potash back in the day. So this is something, and it's people will say, well, isn't that like boiling? And no, the water never gets that high of a temperature. It's just merely a nice water bath, and then we kind of dissolve down to a skeletal form. So rather than the emissions going out into the environment, all of that water that is left over from the process can either go to a seed farmer, it can go to be a natural fertilizer. Again, the circle of life that can go on and do a great many things. And that's pretty neat to think that's water that's helped people transition themselves to the other side. And yet there's still one more use of that versus just putting it into the water treatment plant.
Oh, exactly. So how long does that process usually take?
It takes the same time as a standard cremation.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, so there's some machines that are high-functioning, high-energy machines that really can move the process along the same as a standard cremation. You're looking at, 3 hours for the completion. We have 2 machines here in Oregon. There's one in the Portland area that can move pretty quick. There's one in Roseburg, which is central Oregon, and that's a slower machine. And that will still do the job, but it takes many more hours. It's more low wattage, and the coils inside just heat at a lower temperature. And they're both very energy efficient. They're just 2 different machines, and there's just 2 different ways that the machine does what it does. Now, California has voted this as legal. It's not something yet that is being used, but it is, again, something that is being looked at. I think the energy levels are still being looked at, but it's something that has passed. So more states are finding this thing to be lobbied. It's getting put on their bills. It's getting voted in, and that's what it really needs to do, is become a state statute. And then from there, we go ahead and we can legalize this as a form of disposition. So it's interesting that bodies can be cremated in a standard form or in a water form. We can have a kind of a traditional burial or a natural burial. And then also burial at sea is something else we can do. All states have said burial at sea is a legal form of disposition. I know that's obviously tricky if you have a landlocked state, but being in a natural pine casket or a burlap bag and having no chemicals inside you, being lowered into the waterway and becoming one with the fishes and all, that's pretty darn natural.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good way to think about that. Well, yeah, so it sounds like states are slowly coming around. I had that as a question, too, about it being legal. So it sounds like more and more states are slowly getting on board with this green burial method and green cremation. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, they are. I think just with anything, it takes a little while to get your head around it. I know when standard cremation came out, I think families were thinking, oh my goodness, you're, burning, you're doing something a little barbaric. Mm-hmm. And now cremation, especially on the West Coast, the cremation rates are, ebbing up to about 80%. It becomes a very, very popular idea, that idea of it's less expensive. People think that I just have this urn that I can scatter these cremains or bury them, or I can go ahead and I can just take this box home. But again, with standards and science writers coming out with more information, finding out it's not the most eco-friendly way, we're reverting back to natural burial, where that body in the ground is really the most environmental savvy form of disposition, because your body and all the juicy goodness inside you goes back to get into the permaculture and mix with the fungi and do all this great stuff in the soil. So it's really not just getting rid of a body and putting it underground, but it's allowing that body to be nutritious and delicious to everything around it and to become a tree.
Yeah, that's a great way. We make good fertilizer. So, yeah, that's great. So how did you get involved with this business? Is it a family business, or, how did you choose this career path?
When I was really young, the people who had lived in my household were passing away one by one. I had my paternal grandparents, and then as well as my mother. Within a very short period of time, they had all died. So loss really defined my world as a child. And within a very short period of time, I became an accidental expert at Catholic funerals, because we were just spending a lot of time, doing this. And I realized I did something a little bit different than most children and had a bit of a different life path. I also found that I became that kid that people would come to if they had the loss of a pet or loss of a grandparent. So again, we just sort of sometimes are creatures of habit and environment, and it just seemed like a very natural course of life for me. So I moved on that way. That was my interest. Now, I had found out much, much later in my life, actually I had been in this career for a couple decades, when I had one day had a conversation with my father, who had disclosed that he had an aunt and uncle who owned a funeral home in the Chicago area. And in fact, his great aunt was the first woman licensed in funeral services in Illinois. And, this had come at quite shock that generations had gone back. Obviously, it skipped my parents. We lived on the West Coast, so I didn't spend time in Chicago. His parents weren't alive anymore, kind of a moot point. But with him disclosing this information, I had asked him why this never had come up. And he had said, it's sort of a lousy job. He'd said he saw them working long hours, and they lived in the funeral parlor, and there wasn't a lot of happiness, and he didn't want that life for me. So I think to not encourage me as a young girl wanting to go down this sort of familial path, he never even put that seed in my head that this is something that, yes, we've seen before. You're not coming up with something new.
Yeah. Interesting. And so you began to create this guidebook. It's really a guidebook. You take people step by step through each phase of this. I really like that. So were you, as you got along in this business, did you have a mentor who was guiding you through some of the green burial stuff, or did you just, like you said, just be like, I need to make people happier and give back to the earth, and was this your own doing in a way? That's
a great question. What had happened was, when I had first come out to Cornerstone, which is the funeral home in Boring, I was on my own. I was no longer under the corporate umbrella. So I was finding that I was finally free of that, and I really wanted to keep prices low, be a community funeral home, and get involved with the community and just sort of be that central hub, because my town really has nothing. I'm not even in Boring. I'm in the unincorporated area of Boring, which is me in a mom and pop gas station. I mean, there's a Baptist church. I mean, there's really not much going on in the little strip of the street I live on here. Mm-hmm. So I had a family who had phoned me not too long after I'd been there, who had wanted to meet with me. They were a very gentle group of people, and they'd let me know that there was a woman who lived on their intentional community with them who had died, and they want to keep her there, and they want to bury her on that 15 acres. And they called me to help them do that. And I had to be really honest with them and say, I've never done this. I don't know if this is legal. I have no idea. So we figured it out together. Mm-hmm. And that group of people and myself, we made phone calls. And after talking with individuals with the county and the state and the city, we realized that, yes, indeed, this is legal. We moved forward. We had an absolutely beautiful ceremony. It was natural. It was fantastic. And it really clicked for me that day. As I was driving home from that property, I realized, wow, I always thought my calling was to be an undertaker, but I think really my calling is to be this sort of home funeral and burial undertaker. So I slowly got the reputation in town as being this person who will help assist on these things. And families were coming to me and saying, okay, great, I've got a loved one who is getting close to dying, and, we have a bamboo grove in the backyard, and can somebody make a, casket out of that, and can we keep Grandpa here? And yes, the answers were yes. And I was not reluctant to help families with these things, because I realized not only was it legal, and not only was the mortuary board fully on track, so I had that green light, but also this was really satisfying for families. Yeah. They were saving money. They were doing things their own way. So I didn't have a mentor. I just sort of had to figure it out. But the idea just didn't come to me one day to be a green funeral home. The door opened because people were asking for this. This is what the community wanted. Mm-hmm. And so luckily I was in a position just to go with it, and I'm really glad I did.
Yeah, me too. So if somebody wanted to, have a green burial in their passing, and say maybe it's not accepted in a certain state or somewhere, is it possible for their families to do like you did, kind of research? Is it not legal because people are just unaware of it, or? I don't know. I guess my question is, if somebody wanted to set that up, how would they go about doing that? Is that something that's easy to explain in a podcast?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So it's important for people to know that in all 50 states, green burial is legal. Oh, it is something that you have the right to do. Now, the important thing to figure out is where in your state is it legal? Mm-hmm. Some states say every county has the right to choose if they will allow this in their county, and some states decide that private land burial is not really permissible. So how you find this information out originally is, again, I have this in my book. Right. I have this on many websites. This is, it's readily available information. You can call your local county and ask the question, and then go from there. So let's say you really want to have a natural burial. You want to go to the fabric store and get fabric which really resembles your loved one. You want to wrap them up in it as a shroud. You want to provide your own transportation, whatever you want to do. So the big thing is to figure out where can you bury this loved one. And if you can't do it privately, then you need to find out if there is a cemetery that will allow you to not have to have an outer burial container. And that is the big key. There's cemeteries that are just green, where they won't allow anything which isn't natural. And it's fantastic if you have those. Many, many, many states. There's hundreds of these out there that people aren't aware of. There's also cemeteries which are modern cemeteries, but they allow natural burial either within a section of that cemetery or wherever you want. Here in Portland, Oregon, we have several cemeteries that are established have the big headstones. They have, famous family names, but they've opened their doors to say any space in here, if you want to do a natural burial, great. If you don't want to have a grave liner, if you don't want to have a metal casket, we're cool with it. It's fine. Come on in, which is wonderful. And many states, again, have the same situation. If you don't find a list, either in my book or the National Home Funeral Alliance or the Green Burial Council or these different websites that actually list your city or your state or something, then you can actually call around to some smaller cemeteries and ask and say, would you allow a burial without a grave liner? So a grave liner, an outer burial container, a grave box. It's merely just something which lines the bottom of the grave. The casket goes inside it, and then when the soil refills the grave, it's like having a box around the casket. Therefore, if the casket breaks down over time, you don't get that sort of sinking of the grave. You have that nice, pristine, flat grass. And so that's the only reason why these boxes exist. They're just there so cemeteries can keep, that beautiful, perfect look, not have that weighty, gravy thing. So I've called for families who have looked at my book and said, yeah, but I live out in this county and I can't find anything. And I have been thrilled to call a bunch of local cemeteries. And sometimes you call a small enough cemetery who will say, what? Somebody wants to be buried here? Yeah, sure, we don't care. They're thrilled just to have you buy a grave that they're not going to care about the liner, and there you go. You've got a green burial.
Yeah, interesting. So to set this up, if I wanted to do this for myself and have my family respect my wishes, I would just do a little bit of that research and have that all set in my will to say this is how things are going to be. So, well, that's interesting. And I read somewhere, I think in your book or on your website, maybe it stated there are 150 green burial sites now in America. And those just popped up over the last decade or so, huh?
Yeah, and that number is growing all the time. All the time. And I want to go back to what you said about making your plans in your will.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah, the problem is a will normally sits in a safety deposit box. A safety deposit box normally is not accessed until somebody has a certified copy of a death certificate, meaning someone has already gone into a funeral home, they've already made the plans, you've already been disposed of.
That's true.
Yeah, a will is really kind of found after the fact. So what needs to happen is if someone has interest of this, you make your wishes known. You tell your next of kin, that person who legally has the responsibility of filling out forms for you and signing off on dockets and things, you tell that person, this is what I want to do. It's always wonderful if you have a brightly colored notebook and you write these things down. If you're specific, it's great. If you're really ostentatious and flamboyant, it's a little trickier. I've had families say, I've made all my intentions known and I would like my body to be buried at the base of this volcano, and all these things go on. And not only are you putting the pressure on family who might not be able to take care of these things because of just legalities or monetary issues, what have you.
Right.
So really maybe doing some research and thinking about if you want to have a natural burial, the first step is to figure out where can I have that done, and looking and see if there is a cemetery local to you that would allow that. Do you want to do this on your own land? Just because a lot of states allow this, families sometimes say, well, no, that's not really for me. It's not really what I want to do, and that's fine as well. And then go on from there and decide your ceremony. Do you want to be brought into a church, or do you want to have a visitation, or do you want your family to transport you? You can still use a funeral home, and you still can have a green burial. You still can have a visitation. You still can do all of these things which we consider relatively modern. We're just staying away from embalming. We're staying away from buying a shellacked or some sort of a toxic casket. And then we're trying not to go into a grave, which doesn't allow us to really fully break down and be a part of Earth.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and I love your book. I highly recommend it for those thinking about doing a green burial or learning more about it, because you do talk about in so much more detail of what we're talking about today and step by step, and I think that's wonderful. And we're going to start to close up here a little bit, but I have a couple more questions for you. I believe you facilitate ceremonies as well. Do you have any truly inspirational stories to tell about a green burial ceremony that you may have facilitated?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
One that comes to mind was not that long ago. A naturopathic doctor here in my area was passing, and his family had a little bit of time to prepare, which was nice. You can have a green burial when somebody passes away. You can have one after the fact, but sometimes when you know someone's passing, it gives you a little bit more time to plan.
Mm-hmm.
So he has a farm, which is kind of part of the herbs that get grown to make the medicines. So he had the space and the land, and he was in the rural part of the county. So what he decided was he had me come over, and we looked at the spot where he takes his bath in his old-fashioned clawfoot bathtub right there on the edge of the riverbank, looking down over the sheer cliff to the river.
Oh, my.
And he said, this is where I would like to be. And when the clouds part, you can see a beautiful view of our local Mount Hood. And he wants to face the mountain when he wakes up in the morning, even though he'll be deceased.
Right.
So we plotted out where the space would be. So he picked out the space himself. It was a meaningful space to him because he spent his morning sunbreak hours there. And that's where he wanted to be, which is lovely. So his wife came across one of these old ecopods. And I say old because they're not in production at the moment, but they found one. And it's sort of this decoupaged, wonderful paper mache pod.
Okay.
And she found one of these. She got it out to her, and a wonderful woman with non-toxic paint painted it as the Yellow Submarine from the Beatles. And his idea was, when he was buried, we had a beautiful ceremony for him. Of course, Beatles music was playing. It was just lovely. Bright, colorful flowers. And of course, his casket or his ecopod was beautiful. But his concept was, the day it all goes to hell and we have the earth shaking and the big one comes, he is going to be broken free of his resting place. And in his Yellow Submarine, he is going to cascade down that sheer cliff, be down the river, and off to his next voyage. And something about that was so, it makes me so happy just to think about him and his smiley little face.
I love it. Yeah, I actually got goosebumps, and I'm smiling as you're telling the story. What a way to go. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, good. I love that. So you are not just seeing sadness, you're seeing, I mean, it's sad, but it's there's some good in it, and I like that. So my next question, I always ask all my interviewees, what gives you hope about the future? And this can be with goat rescue, it can be with green burials, or just how you feel in general. What gives you hope and keeps you going of doing this type of work?
On my phone, I have an app, and it's called the Good News Network. And it's nothing but good news all the time. I don't watch traditional news. There's too much stabbing and robbing and all this horrible stuff. Mm-hmm. So this app just talks about the wonderful things that humans do, from a man who takes his free time and rebuilds kids' bikes in his garage to some celebrity who quietly under the wire did some amazing thing. So there's so much good out there that doesn't get reported. So I have that wonderful hope that this is a really, really beautiful world, and you just have to stop for a moment and reflect, and it's all there.
It is. That's great. I need to get that app too. And that's why I started the podcast. I didn't want to talk about the doom and gloom of conservation. I wanted people to say, hey, these people are doing wonderful things, and there's all these things that you can do that are simple or, within your grasp of doing. So wonderful. Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing and enlightening us on the green burial. And I really highly recommend your book, and I have been talking about it since I received my copy. So I think
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I really appreciate your time today. And is there any other questions you may have for us or anything else that you want to talk about quickly?
Yeah, consider keeping any shade of green. Some families say, well, this is a cemetery I've used, and these are the caskets we've used, and we want to go about more of this, what we see as a traditional funeral or cemetery route. Mm-hmm. That's great. If that's going to satisfy you, that's wonderful. Maybe consider a shade of green, maybe using some recycled memorial program folders, or maybe carpooling, or rather than having cut flowers, how about a potted plant? And even succulents are the best because it's such little water. So kind of, try to keep it green.
Yeah, so do it in any step you can, any way that you can.
Exactly. It's all good.
Yeah, that's great advice. So, well, thank you, Elizabeth. And yeah, I wish you well and great success and good luck in feeding your goats this morning.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll probably sing them some mariachi music. They really love that.
Oh, I love it. I love it. You should share some pictures of your goats if you can.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Be Provided Conservation Radio. Links and resources to today's topic are in our show notes on iTunes. We appreciate your dedication and interest in protecting our natural world for future generations. If you like what you heard, please get involved by volunteering, donating, and sharing these podcasts with your friends. It also helps us to inform more people if you take a minute to leave a rating or review on iTunes. Have a great day, and thank you for listening to Be Provided Conservation Radio.